The Automated Podcast.
Welcome to the Automated Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Marc Verbenkov. So today's going to be a little bit different. I'll be touching on some of the more recent, larger newsworthy events of the last few months that are related to automation technologies. So I've actually been debating about whether to do an episode like this every month or maybe every 2 months. So if you like this idea and you, of course, like the episode, let me know either through the website at automatedpodcast.org or via Twitter or LinkedIn by simply searching for Automated Podcast. It'd be nice to hear your feedback on it. So as the podcast now really has a weekly guest format, talking, of course, about specific technologies or interesting industries, due to the vast amount of new changes going on pretty much every single day, it really isn't possible to have a good overview in this format for the show. So that's really kind of the reason for today's episode. It's to kind of get a little bit more of a general overview of the industry or the technology industry as a whole. So also, if you think that there's something that I've missed or left out, which should definitely be in, do let me know and I can make an addendum or an addition in next week's episode. So we can move right into it. The very first one is going to be dealing with OpenAI's GPT-3. I do have a specifically dedicated episode on this technology if you want to learn a little bit more about it. But essentially, Microsoft this week gained an exclusive license to OpenAI's GPT-3. This is, of course, the state-of-the-art language model, which has garnered a lot of attention across the tech industry as of late. And earlier this month, actually, The Guardian published an essay written from scratch by GPT-3, where the editor mentioned overall it actually took less time to edit this specific article than many human op-eds. So as usual, I'll have the link in the show notes to both the technology as well as to the article if you want to read it and look into it a little bit more, as well as to the previous episode that I had specifically dedicated to this very interesting technology. So why is this exclusive licensing deal important? Other companies will actually still be able to access the model through an API, but really only Microsoft will have access to GPT-3's code and the underlying advances of it, allowing it to embed, repurpose, and essentially modify the model as Microsoft pleases. Microsoft also mentioned that this licensing deal, and I'll quote here, allows us to leverage its technical innovations to develop and deliver advanced AI solutions for our customers, as well as create new solutions that harness the amazing power of advanced natural language generation. So no further details were actually given as to exactly how this will be done. But the main issue here, the main point, is that OpenAI was actually originally founded as a non-profit and raised its initial $1 billion on the premise that it would pursue AI for the benefit of humanity. It actually asserted that it would be independent from for-profit financial incentives, and this was actually uniquely positioned to develop AI with society's best interests in mind. However, commercialization did start in 2019, and this latest move really solidifies OpenAI's transformation towards a commercialization entity, which some, if not many, are actually criticizing as simply benefiting one of the already richest companies in the world and not humanity. So as explained by actually MIT Tech Review, the reason this matters is that concern has been growing regarding AI's potential to concentrate power. So as advanced AI requires significant computational resources, it's really only the richest companies that can afford to do this, put it to use, and then, of course, gain the benefits from it. This ultimately gives the tech giants much more power in building and controlling the algorithms that shape our lives going forward into the future. So connected to this, but also as a small side note that I think is actually really important, If you are at all interested about how large tech companies have been modifying behavior for profit, and yes, this does include your behavior, I really can't recommend the documentary The Social Dilemma, which is on Netflix, enough. It can be quite a heavy watch, but definitely worth it, especially if you are a heavy social media user. But that's all I'll say here. Definitely watch the documentary. So moving on to the second point here, and this has to do with Walmart's new drone delivery program. So Walmart has actually recently partnered up with 3 different drone technology companies to start experimenting with the delivery technology. And these are DroneUp, Flytrex, and Zipline, which was already talked about on the podcast in a previous episode. So Walmart, with around 5,000 brick and mortar locations, situated within 10 minutes of 90% of the US population, has increasingly begun using its stores as distribution nodes for e-commerce sales, very much like how Amazon has been set up now. So this pilot program will primarily learn how the customers really interact with this technology. So, what do they do with it? Which bits do they like? What versions of delivery mechanisms do they prefer? Is it convenient? Is it easy? Etc., etc. So like many different technology pilot programs out there, it's really trying to understand the value, the use case, and potentially the business model that these delivery drones can be used in the future. But one of the already known advantages of drones is contactless delivery, which is, of course, much more important in today's era than it was some 6 to 8 months ago. This is going to enable COVID-19 self-collection kits to be delivered to customers already in the northern part of Los Angeles where the pilot site is set up. But actually, each of the different drone companies will be trialing delivery of different goods. So as I've talked about on the podcast in the past, namely with robot delivery trials, this example really shows how automated technologies are encroaching into last mile delivery jobs, which themselves have been growing substantially over the last few years and gotten a really significant boost over the last few months due to COVID. So the next industry or trend that I want to talk about deals with self-driving cars. So what news update would be complete without something coming from Elon Musk, right? Only this past week did he mention that Tesla's full self-driving autopilot system will be ready to test in a month or so. And I think this is really keeping to his word when back in July he mentioned that Tesla would have a full level 5 autonomous vehicle functionality ready by the end of the year. Unfortunately, there was a lack of description of what this autopilot actually entails. But if I do another of these update episodes, I'll be sure to include a description of that and see if it is really the promised level 5 autonomy. So connected to this trend is news that actually comes out of China. So autonomous vehicle startup AutoX announced the public launch of its self-driving taxi service in Shanghai. This is simply called Robotaxi. It already faces competition from a company called Didi, which is China's largest ride-hailing platform, which launched its own robotaxi pilot program in Shanghai at the end of June. However, AutoX's robotaxis will first be available in one specific district with a starting fleet of around 100 vehicles. So rides can be booked through AutoNavi, which is the mapping and transportation booking app, actually owned by Alibaba, which is one of the startup's investors. However, there have been some discussions surrounding the feasibility of actually having robotaxis anytime soon. I will link a few articles in the show notes which do shed a little bit of shade on this trend, especially as the robotaxi programs, like the one I just mentioned above, are really just tests and have not actually shown any financial viability up to this point, and as the articles argue, may not be doing so anytime soon. But what does seem to be gaining interest as a practical alternative, though still, of course, in the testing phase as well, is long-distance truck hauling. So specifically, with a new hub in Dallas, Waymo, one of the industry's leaders, of course, has heavy-duty trucks that have taken to Texas roads to start the company's road testing of its driverless fleet. And this fleet consists of 13 18-wheeler trucks complete with cameras, LiDAR, and onboard computers. So though the trucks won't be running completely autonomously, they will actually have a safety driver on board ready to take over at any moment. But the company does plan to hire local truck drivers for these specific jobs. So the trucks also won't be carrying any commercial goods yet, but they will be loaded with weights to mimic a commercial load. However, Waymo hasn't yet said how long the testing phase will last or when it thinks its trucks will start operating fully autonomously. But it is certainly an interesting pivot coming from one of the early robotaxi pioneers, which might be a signal of a change in the robotaxi industry as a whole. Of course, as I mentioned before, as these articles are arguing. But moving on to one of the last points here, let's look at universal basic income. So interestingly, to date, Finland is the only country that has managed to complete a nationwide randomized controlled trial of a basic income program, or something at the very least symbolizing a basic income program. So actually, McKinsey Consulting came out with a report which analyzes this Finnish study. I'll, of course, link it in the show notes if you want to read more about it. But overall, in Finland's 2-year study, a treatment group of some 2,000 randomly picked, initially unemployed people received a guaranteed, unconditional, automatic cash payment of a modest €560 per month payment instead of a basic unemployment allowance in roughly similar amounts. So the final result from the experiment showed that the basic income trial in Finland led to small increases in employment, significantly boosted multiple measures of the recipients' well-being, and also reinforced positive individual and societal feedback loops, which is quite consistent with a number of the other studies that I've talked about on the podcast before and that have just been coming out over the last several years. But it is also worth noting that the methods, as well as the conclusion of the Finnish study, were not undisputed. But even given that, I think it is good to see yet another data point on this very large and ever-growing in importance topic. So finally today, I do want to look a little bit at education. So though I think now that most people are familiar with the term MOOCs or have at least taken one of these massive open online courses, a very recent update from Google is adding, I think, another layer of impact to this education industry. So Google certificates. These certificates are created and taught by Google employees. They do not require a college degree and can be completed in 3 to 6 months. And more importantly, they are offered through the online learning platform Coursera. So Google says it will consider all of its certificates as the equivalent of a 4-year college degree for related roles at the company. So though Google did launch an IT-specific certificate in 2018, which has had some 250,000 registered participants, this new set of certificates, which includes project management and data analyst, have already helped a number of underrepresented groups advance in the job market who typically do not have easy access to a 4-year university degree. So as with most MOOCs, the certificate courses remain online without the need for a teacher to actually be present to teach the course. They also offer a form of automated or self-paced learning, which is of course very well known with any kind of MOOC program. So most importantly, I think, this is one of the first industry disruptors that is offered by a private tech company, which can essentially replace a university degree and might be one of the largest steps in the disruption of the traditional education institution. And of course, as always, if you want to learn more or look at it more, I'll have the link to these different Google certificates, as well as to most of the other things that I mentioned in this shorter episode today in the show notes of the website. So do feel free to check it out. And yeah, thanks for listening. If you have any feedback for this episode, as it's a little bit different from the recent episode formats, do let me know. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can leave a like or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to get in touch, feel free to do so over Twitter or LinkedIn by searching for Automated Podcast. On the website, automatedpodcast.org, you can leave a comment on any of the episodes, read the transcripts, and look at the sources I use in all of these episodes. There are also blog articles and additional resources and information on this topic and podcast if you are looking for more. See you next week.
The Automated Podcast.